Okay, welcome everyone to the second panel. This one is going to be from 10:10 EST to 11:10 EST. And I'm just going to go ahead and hand it straight off to Samantha, our moderator.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Again, this is the first annual Max Stirner Symposium. This is our second panel of the day, and the topic at hand today is Stirner and revolutionary politics. And we have our two speakers here alongside us, Dwayne Roussel and Jacob Blumfeld. And kind of a quick comment on format, essentially, each presenter is going to go for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back in the end for like a 20 or a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. On that note, if you have any questions at any point, just throw them in the Q&A, and then at the end, I will go through them with the presenters. So a note on our first speaker, his name is Dwayne Roussel. Roussel is a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst as well as a sociological theorist. He's currently an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Technology at Guwahati, as well as a visiting associate professor at the University College of Dublin, University College of Cork, and Nosborough University. His research is obviously around sort of psychoanalysis, as well as sort of, I guess, post-anarchism, this kind of interaction between sort of what's broadly construed as post-structural theory and anarchist theory. On that note, I'm just going to go ahead and hand things over to them. His presentation is entitled Stirner's Revolutionary Impulses. Thanks so much, Dwayne.
Thank you, Samantha. If I may, I'd like to at least begin by also thanking Cal Nelson for organizing this symposium. It's a real feat to bring a union of egoists together. And the Department of Philosophy is at the Kesne University for sponsoring such a curious symposium. And I suppose I'd also like to make special mention of Dr. Saul Newman, who's been a real pioneer in anarchist studies, but also has supported my idiosyncratic work for a long time. In fact, I was thinking while people were speaking that I know that there's at least one or two people here attending the symposium who I've known for maybe 20 years or more. And I hesitate to mention it, but I will. It makes me feel a little nostalgic. And nostalgia, I would say, is a sentiment according to which one longs to return to the world, a world that has long gone missing. And so it's an expression of loss, you know, and so there are some in our purview today, perhaps not here, but who want to resurrect old patriarchal hierarchies, or who aim to rebuild the left, to rebuild social movements and political movements that of the past. Today, I would say I hope to have the same courage that I've maybe, and the same orientation that has inspired me for 20 years. So let's see what I can do. There's only a few minutes now. I've already wasted a lot of time. I'd just like to isolate maybe a few points at the intersection of the writings of Max Stirner and the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. It's tempting to take Stirner all by himself. I'm refusing that temptation. By the way, spontaneously, I'm thinking, now the thoughts are coming to me, for Lacan, psychoanalysis was resolutely anti-political. It's an important point, which doesn't mean it doesn't speak to politics, that we can't talk about a politics of the unconscious or the unconscious as politics and these sorts of things, but Lacan saw psychoanalytic discourse as the only counterpoint to discourses of mastery, of which we might situate political discourse, perhaps, but also a counterpoint to the segregative politics of comrades and brothers. Anyway, I'll begin maybe with a question. What is revolution? I think I'd say very concisely, it's a return. It's a return to the same. That's how Lacan put it. I've made the word revolution a coordinate for thinking within the Lacanian psychoanalytic orientation. For Lacan, revolution was associated with the birth of science, because at the origin of science, one looked to the skies and witnessed the heavenly bodies, the constellations, which we would have to draw connections between the stars to witness, looked to the skies to see that they would return each night. He also associated revolution with the real, which always returns to its place, but also revolutionary discourse with a return to the problem of mastery, an aspiration to escape the world of the master only to return to it. So I say there are revolutionary aspirations, yes, but revolutionary impulses also exist. And this point, I think, is fundamental for moving forward. The revolutionary aspiration of modern anarchism existed within a world of masters, to put it simply, within which our little revolutionary subject would find herself to be missing, which means there was a crisis of representation. So she staged a confrontation with the master without realizing that her aspirations were fostered by that world of mastery. So the proclamation was, I mean, it came much later, but it expressed the sentiments of the time very well. Another world is possible. Another world is possible. The truth of all revolutionary aspirations is this: what they aspire to is a master. But I take pains to hear the melancholics for whom the world has already gone missing. I mean, I hesitate to mention Mark Fisher, Louis Althusser, Julia Kristeva, and so many others from whom I discovered a revolution without world, which allowed me to catch a glimpse of this hopeless impulse of insurrection. The insurrection has no hope. Revolutionary aspirations deceptively march forward within a world, but the impulses hold firm. They hold firm because they remain fixed, always returning to the same place. For this reason, I claim that the impulses are sterner than the aspirations, which means that they're serious. A furrowed brow, as Niharika was mentioning to me earlier outside of this chat, who's watching now. They're serious because their repetitions constitute a series, one by one. So there is a disjuncture of aspirations for another world from the impulses which repeat without a world. So on this point, I offer just a really simple distinction. Dialectics and repetition. Dialectics and repetition. Repetition is not reducible to dialectic, as philosophers seem to have figured out quite some time ago, but for psychoanalysts, it's new stuff. Dialectic consists of an illusory movement within the world, while repetition exhibits a stubborn tendency to remain in place. Hegel, of course, the foremost philosopher of dialectics, wrote in a letter in 1816, I quote him, "I adhere to the view that the world spirit has given the age marching orders. These orders are being obeyed. The world spirit proceeds irresistibly with imperceptible movement. Innumerable light troops throw themselves for or against its progress," end quote. But today is perhaps an age of counter-globalization, supposed multipolarity, not of movement. It's one of stasis, which fixes itself on its drive toward death. In a short essay, as you know better than I do, Art and Religion by Stirner, Stirner stubbornly opposed himself to the very principle of sublimation, what psychoanalysts later called sublimation. I'm paraphrasing something he said. He places his pulverizing hands upon all the business of making objects so as to breathe the air of freedom. That's how he put it, something like that. And this word freedom I find interesting in Stirner's work. It appears sometimes as a fixed idea, which uses him up, drains something of his substance. And at other times, he uses it as the backdrop against which to oppose fixed ideas. So he will appeal to freedom, maybe a new freedom, but freedom nonetheless, when he refuses to engage in the world of fiction. So I would say he breathes the error of freedom, the error of freedom. It's an equivocation, which opens up another reading. Stirner eradicates every trace of objects, positioning himself radically outside of the world, in a sense, making himself the world. Against fixed ideas, against spooks, against illusions, fictions, and so on, to breathe the error of freedom is precisely to occupy the position that Jacques Lacan called, somewhere in his 21st seminar, I think, the non-dupes, the position of the non-dupes heir, the non-dupes heir. It means that those who refuse to believe in the fictions of the world, in spooks and so on, are perhaps even more duped by them. It's an alternative reading. They're all the more duped because they fail to see that it's precisely only through fiction that you can engage in the world. And so it's possible that Stirner was more duped by the very objects that he opposed, more duped than those he repeatedly accused, Feuerbach and so on. Because his effort was in some sense to occupy a very lonely position outside of the fictions. He wasn't duped by the fictions, by what Lacan calls the common air. He wasn't a commoner. And so for him, I think these objects were at times too real, in the sense that they were too asphyxiating, too proximate to him, which is why he tried to break them. For example, I would counterpose Stirner's object to what Lacan called the signifier. What's a signifier? The signifier is a really special concept in psychoanalysis because it's radically dissociated from any trace of an object. A signifier doesn't refer to an object. It doesn't refer to a trace of an object. You could say, as Lacan did in his third seminar, I'm thinking spontaneous, but Lacan said in his third seminar, a sign corresponds directly to an object. A trace is the impression left when an object goes missing, like a footprint of the sand or whatever. A signifier is what you can have when there's no trace of an object. It only points at another signifier, which again is radically dissociated from any object. So a signifier is what destroys the object. And it's only in losing the object that you can enter into the domain of fictions and have a sense of subjectivity, according to Lacan. Subjectivity being what's missing within the world, but within the world it's missing. And so when you concede to the signifier, you concede that the world is a fiction of objects and that those objects must be abandoned. You have to evacuate them of substance. And it's on this condition that one can enter a world. As for repetition, repetition is what repeats outside of a world, which means outside of the impact of a signifier. There's a fixation, now I'm sounding very philosophical, forgive me, but there's a fixation of substance for Stirner, which endures, which is tethered to its object during each interval, tethered to its place. And what repeats is that which he will not relinquish during each interval. And we can say that Stirner appealed to an object known as nothing. On the other hand, the dialectic marches forward because the object has gone missing, introducing what some philosophers today call constitutive negativity, a gap within which our little revolutionary subject can be situated. I think Stirner's genius was to locate repetition in what others called progress. Social relations that were hitherto organized by God or capital gave way to a worse arrangement, horizontally organized, which is the horizon of politics, according to ideals of humanity or communism. Stirner was very clear on this point. It does not constitute progress. But he always did so by appealing to an object substance, a nothing, creative nothing. It's clear that for him, nothing wasn't a gap within the world. It was a creative nothing. It's not a lack. It's not radical subjectivity. Here, I think, I'm thinking of some of the presentations earlier, we move from ontology to what Rainer Sherman calls enology. The one of substance, rather than a being in the world. It's not nothing as something missing, as what some Lacanians for a while were calling the place of constitutive lack or whatever. It's the place of what Lacan in his late teaching called the parler-être, the speaking being who speaks not in a common language through the common air, but with its enjoyment, with its substance, its satisfactions, its body. The parler-être is a speaking being who speaks outside of the impact of the signifier. So Stirner was not nothing in the sense of emptiness. He was the creative nothing out of which he himself built a world for himself. So where does it leave us? I don't know how much time I have left, but I believe that Stirner's lesson is that it's not enough to demolish hierarchies. And that it's not enough to sustain a space of horizontal ideals that can sustain certain fraternal group relations that are now constituting themselves within the domain of radical social movements. There are revolutions which outlive the subject, and I think they're dangerous because they're not associated with what Freud called the pleasure principle and its delayed action principle, the reality principle. It's death drive. So I propose I'll try and wrap it up. I propose we begin to think about another mode of social organization. And if I had more time, I'd maybe try to demonstrate how it is that the Lacanian concept of the cartel, which seems a bit like the anarchist affinity group, or the union of egoists, and the Lacanian concept of a school offers a counterpoint to the exploitative effects of hierarchy and the segregative effects of egalitarianism, horizontalism, and so on. Yet at the same time, without leaving a unique one, in isolation as a master of its own satisfactions. So in summary, I would just say, I wouldn't claim that another world is possible, but I also wouldn't claim that we can sustain ourselves without a world. I would simply say, not without world. I think, that's where I'll stop. Entirely unsatisfied by everything that I've just said.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really insightful. So much there to chew on. But I'm going to go ahead and start moving towards our next presenter. Our next presenter is Jacob Bloomfield. Jacob is currently an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Oldenburg. His research interests sort of explore political philosophy and social philosophy, sort of German idealism, anarchism, and the like. This presentation specifically is called The Redemption of St. Max, Stirner's Critique of Marx. And on that note, I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to Jacob. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. So I have a very different presentation than the last one because mine's very historical and specific, but I hope it can maybe lead to some general thinking about Stirner's relevance today. I have a lot of material, so I don't know if I'll get through it all. There's a lot of words are going to flash, but if you don't read them all and you get confused, that's okay. Confusion is underestimated. So this is the title of my presentation, which will hopefully be a paper soon. I haven't written on Stirner since my book came out like 5 years ago. So I'm trying to return to Stirner, but with fresh eyes. Usually people talk about Marx's critique of Stirner. I'm here to flip that and talk about Stirner's critique of Marx. So let's go. Now, this is the organization of the text I'll be discussing. First will be the Jewish question, just one line, written in 44 or 43. Then in 44, 45, you have Stirner's two books, right? You have The Unique and Its Property and Stirner's Critics. And then immediately following that, you have Marx's manuscripts called St. Max, which later gets edited and turned into the German ideology. And this is a conversation. This is my argument here. There's a conversation going on between these texts. People usually think that the conversation starts with Stirner and ends with Marx. In my reading, it starts with Marx and it ends with Stirner. So what's the argument of my presentation? It's very simple. Stirner criticizes Marx's concept of the human being and species being from his Jewish question text as ideological. Marx then responds by criticizing Stirner's egoism as idealist. We all know this. But in so doing, Marx adopts Stirner's critique of the concept of the human being and adopts his concept of the unhuman, incorporating it into his more negative materialist anthropology. In Marx's reading, the human is then rendered a historical category, always related to the unhuman, mediated by the relation to the productive forces and the system of needs. This perspective, in my eyes, opens up a new way of thinking about communism, according to Marx's kind of German ideology, one based in the material conditions for individual self-appropriation, which to me validates and vindicates St. Max, right? It redeems him. So let's start with Marx. So in the Jewish question, he has this one line that Stirner picks up on, where he says, at the end of this paragraph, man who is not yet a real species being. So he says in political democracy is too Christian, right? Because we're not actually real in our democracies. We're asocial, we're economic beings, right? We're corrupted. We're not our real selves, right? We're not real species beings. This is one of Marx's arguments, one of Marx's first texts on alienation, right? Stirner reads this text and he's the first person, I think in the world to cite Marx. And he cites Marx in Die Einzige, in this line that people probably know, where he's talking about, I think this is his critique of liberalism. It's in this section. He said something like, to identify me now entirely with the human being, the demand has been invented and stated that I must become a real species being, right? A wirkliches Gattungswesen. So he says, okay, in this line of liberalism, humanism, socialism, we're demanded to be something we're not. Here's another example of what we're demanded to be. We're demanded to be human beings, and species being is just one way of specifying what it means to be human. That's Marx's way, and therefore it's another ideological trap. That's Stirner's very kind of first start in the debate, but he expands on this, right? What I want to do is spend this to understand. So, what is his critique of the human being? Well, interestingly for Stirner, he doesn't just say, humanism is ideological, it's disruptive. he posits a counter concept, right? His counter concept is the Unmensch, the Unmenschliche, sometimes translated as the inhuman monster, but I like the more literal translation, the unman, or even better, the unhuman. He says, what is an unhuman, right? This is the perspective from which he's going to criticize the human being. He says, it is a human being, so the unhuman is a human being, first of all, who doesn't correspond to the concept human being, as the inhuman is something human that doesn't fit the concept of the human. Logic calls this a nonsensical judgment, right? And Marx will pick up on this idea of a nonsensical judgment. Then he concludes this by saying, only the unhuman is an actual human. So the beginning of this kind of dialectical reversal of categories that's so present in Stirner's writing is right here in this discussion of the unhuman. He wants to reject the category of the human being as generic, as abstract, as flattening. He says, you know, no human being corresponds to this actual category, right? So therefore, I must be an inhuman being. But actually, we're all inhuman beings, right? Because none of us actually correspond to the category. That's what an unhuman being is, but what is a human being? Well, to be a human being doesn't mean fulfilling the ideal of the human being, right? But rather to present oneself. He uses the verb darstellen, right? This kind of presentation, this or sometimes also translated as representation. To present oneself, the individual, right? He's not trying to satisfy generic human needs, but myself. I am my species, right? He uses the word Gattung here again. I am without norm, without law, without model. So the human being, like a human being is not the human being. Right? A human being satisfies itself, it presents itself. The human being is a set of criteria which must be fulfilled to be recognized, right, as a member of a species. Stirner will say more about this in Stirner's Critics, but I'm going to come back to that. Because I have little time, I'm going to skip a lot. And let's just jump right into Marx. So Stirner discusses this, criticizes the human being, criticizes the species being, posits a counter concept of the unhuman being, and defends the unhuman against the human. Engels reads Stirner's books, loves it. He tells Marx in a letter, this is great, you got to read this. He's like, this guy, he's a communist, he just doesn't know it yet. Marx did not agree, right? He says, I don't like it. So they write this manuscript, right, to figure out why they don't like it. 300 pages on Stirner. He calls this manuscript St. Max, right? It's not called the German ideology. There's no such thing as the German ideology, just a side note. The Feuerbach chapter is basically all about Stirner. It's not about Feuerbach. And the St. Max section was actually the first section ever published from this manuscript by Bernstein. So what is this manuscript called St. Max? Well, it's a discussion of Bauer, of Schelige, of Feuerbach, of Hess. In this manuscript, Marx discusses Stirner's Einzige, but he also discusses Stirner's Critics, right? He called it the apologetical commentary. And he used this structure of allusion to describe this book. He used a religious structure and a literary structure with very interesting allusions to Don Quixote and Portuguese poetry like Luís de Camões, also Faust, and all these different kind of ways of ridiculing and insulting Stirner, right? He sometimes can't do it directly. He needs to call on another apparatus, right? Almost like Stirner does in his work. That's for another conversation. What's Marx's main critique of Stirner? Well, I'm sure you all know this already, but Stirner, he criticizes Stirner for saying that he takes ideas to be kind of dominating us, right? So if we could just remove the ideas from our heads, we could be liberated. Marx says, well, how did it come about that people got these illusions into their heads? That's his critique, right? It's very simple. Marx says that's what we need to look at, not the content of the illusions themselves, not the spoofs, not the abstractions, but the material process by which these illusions are generated and reproduced through daily life, right? And this has to do with the structure of labor, the structure of production. If we just stick with philosophy, we are just, quote, doing onanism, which is masturbation, right? We're not actually engaged in social life. We need to abandon philosophy. Let's get to the specific content of my topic, though, right? Not the critique of Stirner in general, which a lot of people talk about and discuss, but this more specific content of the Mensch and the Unmensch, which I find very interesting and undiscussed or under-discussed. So at the end of the Old Testament section of the St. Max manuscript, Marx introduces the concept of the unhuman, right? So he says, Stirner uses this concept of the unhuman to criticize the human being, right? And Stirner uses this concept to criticize Bauer. Now, in this section, which is called Solomon's Songs, Solomon's Song of Songs, right? This famous section of the Old Testament in which Solomon writes love songs. He discusses lots of Stirner's writings on the Unmensch, but he actually doesn't discuss the one quote where he's criticized. But we know he read it, right? Because he's reading above and before it. Marx summarizes, right, Stirner's argument like this. And the quotes are very important here because this is kind of just by using quotation marks, he's calling into question Stirner's argument. So according to Marx, Stirner is saying the concept human being is not the real human being. The concept human being is the human being, right? The substantive. But the human being is not the real human being. The real human being is therefore, and this is the trick, the non-human, i.e. the unhuman. In conclusion, only the unhuman being is the real human being, which is basically a quote from Stirner, right? So Marx quotes then Stirner's definition of the unhuman on this page, the previous quote already read. So Marx thinks this is like a linguistic fallacy, right? He's taking this negation and then turning it into a substantive, right? Just because the concept is not real, therefore only every real must be this new concept, the unhuman being. Marx thinks this is just a linguistic trick here. However, he does think Stirner is onto something, right? He thinks there's something here that's true, but it's not this like linguistic ideological game. There's something else. So what is this something else? What is true about Stirner's concept of the unhuman? So as you see, Marx says, this nonsensical judgment, which Stirner recognized that philosophers would criticize him for, this nonsensical judgment that the real human is not human, in the sphere of abstraction, right, in the sphere of philosophy, it just expresses in a universal language the actually existing universal contradiction between the conditions and the needs of human beings. So Stirner's critique of the human, right, his positing of the unhuman, is for Marx a way of expressing a real contradiction in society between the conditions of human beings and their needs and how they're being met or not met. I carry on. The nonsensical form of the abstract proposition fully corresponds to the nonsensical character carried to extreme lengths of the relations of bourgeois society. So as we see here, Marx is saying, Stirner actually got it right. He just didn't realize he got it right? He didn't understand the object that he was criticizing, which is society itself. He thinks he's criticizing ideas, but he's actually criticizing society. And we can talk about whether that's right or not. So according to Marx, Stirner thinks that we have to get the idea of the human out of our head to end in human conditions, right? And then Marx tells this story of how he thinks change happens in Stirner, right? So this is what Marx thinks, Stirner thinks about how does society change. Stirner, right, imagines that human beings up to now have always formed a concept of the human, like a norm. And then we won freedom from themselves to the extent that that was necessary to realize this concept, which is already an interesting kind of error, right? Because obviously Stirner doesn't believe that we win freedom, right? So then Marx says the measure of freedom achieved is determined by the concept, right? So it's unavoidable that this concept of the human leaves a residue, right? Something that's left out of this ideal in every society. What's left out of this ideal of the human in every society is the inhuman, right? And Stirner's picking up on that residue, this leftover, and he's defending it against the human. I think Marx is half right here, right? It is kind of what Stirner's doing. He is picking up on this residue, what's left out of the human category, but he's not doing it in this kind of theological, historical, philosophical way. Then Marx responds with his version of what's actually happening. So he said, in reality, what happened was that people won freedom for themselves each time to the extent that was dictated and permitted not by their ideal of man, but by the existing productive forces. Right? So it's a very productivist, very deterministic theory here. But he says, you know, I think I'm getting closer to the end, so I'll have to wrap up. The productive forces, right, like the state of society of who needs to be met, always has a gap. It cannot fulfill the needs of everyone. Right? Therefore, history develops by people demanding more and more of their needs to be met. And this happens from those who are lacking it, who are those who are considered inhuman, right? And that's the struggle to be meet new needs. Now, according to Marx, there are good and bad ways of fulfilling these needs, right? There are ways that actually challenge the productive forces, that challenge the distribution of power in society. And there are ways that don't, right? That just rebel, that just try to satisfy their needs immediately. And for Marx, this is also what the inhuman is. The inhuman is not that which is left out of the human. It's also that which tries to meet its needs immediately, right? Without law. Without collective struggle, just to immediately take it, right? Almost in an insurrectionary way. So this is also something that he thinks Stirner is adequately grasping, right? This insurrectionary aspect of the poor, of the rabble, which he calls the inhuman. Marx says that this inhuman is the negative aspect is this rebellion, right? So the concept of the human for Marx just corresponds to those people in society who can meet their needs, like the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the inhuman corresponds to those who can't and who rebel against it. Now, Stirner, kind of grasped this, but he should have pushed it farther, according to Marx. He should have said everyone should be able to meet their needs, right? I think okay, 2 more minutes. I'm good around the 5:50. Okay, 3 more minutes. Here. Okay, so this is my summary of Marx's criticism. Sorry for the speed dial. All class societies are based on opposition, according to Marx, right? Feudal and serf and lord, slave and master, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Human and inhuman is also an opposition that structures society, but it's not a metaphysical distinction from Marx. It's a class one, right? Human are those who can meet their needs the normal way, through labor, through money, through exchange, through inheritance. Unhuman, right, the unmensch, are those who can't meet their needs that way, who don't have work, who don't have money, who cannot rely on the law, who cannot rely on the state, right? Or maybe because there's not enough goods being produced. So that's one definition of the human, right? The positive definition, but then there's the negative definition of the inhuman. Those who meet their needs, not by negating those relations, but just by rebellion, right? Pure rebellion, indignity. The primitive rebels, as Hobsbawm calls them, or the Luddites, right? The anarchists, the illegalists, those who resist but without revolution, as Duane said. Marx then ends this discussion of the inhuman by saying, if Sancho, right, his kind of nickname for Stirner, if Sancho was able to tackle the subject of becoming free with the desire of freeing himself not merely from categories, but from actual fetters, then such liberation would presuppose a common change to him and to a large mass of other people, and would produce a change in the state of the world, which should again be common to him and others. And then this last quote basically is saying that Marx is saying that, if we take Stirner's critique of the human seriously, right, this basically leads to communism. Right? So what we want individuals to have power over their social conditions. Right? That's what Stirner wants. He wants power over our individual conditions, power over that which alienates us. Marx says, of course, that's what we want. But to do that, right, to have this individuality, which is denied in a society in which treats you as inhuman, requires something like communist way of life, collective struggle. I want to end just with a couple of quotes from Stirner's critics, just to say, actually, this is what Stirner was more complex. Marx didn't actually grasp everything of Stirner's concept. For Stirner, the inhuman was not really something he actually defended. He was just posing against the human, right? He could have defended the human if he wanted to, but then he would have been misunderstood. Yeah, you know what? I'll just end with this. in Stirner's critics, he tried to complicate this distinction, right? He doesn't want to take it as an absolute like Marx does. He said that actually this distinction is fluid. This distinction dissolves, right? It dissolves in both its positive and its negative elements in us, right? In the I, in the unique, right? In our own subjectivity. And therefore, Stirner, I think, affirms the negativity that Marx says is essential but not sufficient to a revolutionary change. Thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you to both our presenters. There's so much to think about. I will briefly remind people, if you have any questions, do feel free to shoot them in the chat. We're doing pretty good on time. We're going till 11:10. So we have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. But I'll go ahead and start things off with a question for Dwayne, if that's okay. Something that you kind of didn't have the time to touch on was this idea of the Lacanian school. And I was wondering if you wouldn't maybe take a little time to elaborate on that more, because yeah, I think that might be kind of an important part of kind of the counter, and maybe not counter, but kind of the non-political forms of organization maybe we can start thinking about. I'm not sure if that's, yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, I had been trying to think about sort of like a personal history or biography that connects my very early and long-lasting interest in anarchist thought, particularly certain disruptive figures within the anarchist tradition that include Stirner, Nakiev, and so many others, including the post-left tendencies out of California and this sort of stuff, and how that connected with the school. And what's interesting about the school is that when it was developed, and this was said by Jacques-Alain Miller, immediately at the onset of its association, it returned each one back to their loneliness. And it said that the cartel is the fundamental organ of the school, and the school and the cartel are, of course, modes of social organization, paradoxically. But what's interesting in a cartel is that you have a certain endless disruption of the group effects that can lead toward hierarchy and what Lacan called in his the beginning of his later teaching, fraternity, both of which are problematic tendencies for various reasons. And so, the affinity group, the union of egoists, and so on, here we see, I think, people that have been experimenting with a mode of organization that keeps thought moving in a constant, let's say, insurrection, without it ever necessarily resting on a fixed idea. And when it does, there's an effort on behalf of what's called the +1 in the cartel to maybe equivocate on it, or to keep the knowledge moving yet again, to offer alternative readings, which is what Lacan always did in his teaching. He would say, nom de père, nom de père, non doute error, and so on, which are equivocations. And what an equivocation does is it introduces another reading. And the worst thing would be to fix Stirner's thought in place for history. And yeah, I suppose that's the preliminary to an answer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And maybe if I could, I don't want to ask you two questions in a row, but this kind of connects to, I think, what I'm kind of curious about with Jacob is how, like, maybe for you, Dwayne, like, what do you really, coming from like a Lacanian perspective, think about the idea of a social relationship, and like that kind of how like Marx gives a certain like gravity to this idea of a social relation? And I'm kind of like, I mean, is that just like, I don't know, some sort of like false like fixation in your view, and or do you see that as maybe having a certain another type of layer to it, if that makes sense?
It does a little bit. I was really struck by a quote that Jacob used in the slide, particularly at the end of one of the slides, where Marx was basically, I'm simplifying to the extreme, so forgive me, but he was basically accusing Stirner of only being interested in I don't know, a revolution outside of what is common to others. The word was common. And I really like that because Lacan said that the common error is to actually believe that there is something common, which is to believe in a world of fictions and illusions and these sorts of things. And so what happens, which is really interesting, let's say at the end of a clinical analysis, is in some sense you become a bit like Stirner. You become like not duped by anything. And the world falls, and it becomes a question of how you can engage at that point. And you become a master of your own satisfactions, what Lacan would say, master of your own jouissance, and these sorts of things. And I think what the cartel allows you to do is to not be without a world, right? And when you talk about a union of egoists, we don't quite know what it means, but if we were to develop that point, I think there's a way to bring this idea, which is basically empty, of a union of egoists, and to form a social bond that would be meaningful, that wouldn't reduce us to a common world, the illusion of a common world, but also wouldn't lead us back to simply being masters of our own enjoyment, masters of our own jouissance, and so on, which is what you find with a lot of people after they come to the end of their analysis. Some people would call it a cynical end to analysis. I don't believe in anything anymore and this sort of stuff. I know it really well because I think what Stirner maybe struggled from, if he struggled at all, is the same thing that I have often struggled from. How to believe in something again so that you can relate to people and these sorts of things. And I think ultimately what the cartel allows you to do is to not be without a world at a time when your world has fallen. And so that's why I've kind of gone in that direction, but it was my choice.
Thank you very much. We had a couple questions pop up to the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and go to those. This first one is for Jacob, I believe. So Jacob, it seems that the unhuman for Marx would then be closely connected to his definition of the proletarian and the critique of Hegel's right, in which it is defined as an estate that is not an estate within bourgeoisie society. Can you expand on what might be sort of the similarity between the two formulations? There is some more detail. I'll go ahead and read. Similarly, Lucio Coletti has argued that Marx's notion of species being goes back to early Renaissance formulations about empty and plastic essence of the human, such as found in Pico deo Mirandola. However, it seems that Stirner is closer to this. Can you say more about what Stirner might add to flesh out this malleable and vacuous aspect of the human species? And that's from Idris Robinson.
Yeah, thank you, Idris, for those great questions. On the first question, the proletariat in Marx, I think there's a very close connection between a certain understanding of proletariat in Marx and Stirner's concept of the inhuman. But you'd have to distinguish between proletarian and working class, which some people collapse together, right? So proletarian is usually a negative category in Marx, right? It's that which has nothing, right? Nothing to sell for their labor, right? It only has its children to reproduce, right? Or in the classical Roman sense, it's a negative category. But that negative category is then universal, right? Because it has nothing to lose. It's the class of all classes. I think for Stirner, the inhuman is also kind of this residue, this negative category that has something universal to it, right? Everyone is in a sense inhuman, right? So it's not a class category for Stirner, but there is a universal aspect to the inhumanist that maps onto Marx's concept of the proletariat, which gets confused if you take it to mean working class, which means kind of a positive contribution, a positive determination of those who can come together based on the identity of work or labor, which I would say is a different concept, right? A different distinction. With the concept of species being, Marx or Stirner criticizes Marx's concept of the species being, and then people say Marx abandoned this concept, right? Based on Stirner's critique, he stopped being a humanist anymore. It could be argued that Marx's concept is actually much more complex than what Stirner gives him credit for. So in the manuscripts, the species being, there's a big Hegelian influence there. What does it mean to be a species being actually? You can read this in a Stirnerian way, right? Because it doesn't mean being like defined by your species attributes. For Marx, being a species being means being free of your species attributes, right? You can actually be every species. So, you're able to not be determined by your instincts, by which other animals are. And that is something close to Stirner, right? So although I think there is something interesting there to rethink the concept of species being, maybe with Stirner, and this kind of plastic essence that you're hinting at. So thanks for those questions, Idris.
Yeah, that was a wonderful question. Thanks so much. Another question in the chat from Adam Jones. Let me see here. I believe this is towards you again, Jacob. I'll go ahead and read it off for you. To what extent is Stirner fundamentally limited in his conception of the insurrectionary tendency of the unhuman by his own interlocutors, such as Feuerbach, Boyer, and the more Feuerbachian Bauerian Marx? While Stirner was no stranger to political economy as evidenced by his translation of Adam Smith, Marx points out the resistance to talking about economic historical conditions. Is Stirner's more phenomenological description of the experience of the unhuman a fatal occlusion of his textual intervention, or does it solidify its potential for what Jacob once called the, quote, first-person Marxism?
Adam, also a great question. I think there is a value to Stirner's perspective, to kind of his literary, his phenomenological perspective of being inhuman, right? Of being outside, of being outcast, of being not subsumed into the category of the human being. And that's a perspective, I would say, from the inside that gets lost in Marx's kind of social totalizing framework, which tries to grasp the dynamic of society as a whole, and then the kind of actors within it, right? And the proletariat is one actor within it, but there are other classes that fight and battle. Sometimes Marx kind of gets into more like polemical and like emotional language to side with the working class, but it's not from that first person. And therefore it loses the effective and the elements of what it means to be inhuman. That's why Marx cannot really grasp, I think, the nature of the inhuman from the inside. Stirner, I think, is doing it from the inside, what it means to be categorized and miscategorized, right? So yeah, I think it's important to hold on to that perspective and to not give it up, even though it's not contradictory to like a social perspective, right? Why would a first person perspective negate perspective of the whole? Right? Just because I'm seeing something from eyes doesn't mean I can't also think about it from another perspective, right? But if you deny that first-person perspective, then you are denying something essential to how we see the world. So I think it's really important to keep hold of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have about 5 more minutes for questions, and we do have another one here for you, Dwayne. This is from Nick, and Nick asks, do you see any similarity, and it's kind of a general question, but maybe you can speak to it more. Do you see any similarity between the concept of lack as a prerequisite for desire in Lacan and the Stirnerian concept of creative nothing specifically?
Yeah, a very important question. I don't know what I can say. Let's see. I really like what Jacob was just saying about species being, which to my ears I mistook for a moment as speaking being. What I was saying is parlettre. But what does Marx do? Maybe I'll come around to an answer to this question somehow. Who knows? I surprise myself sometimes. But what does Marx do immediately upon introducing the category of species being? Immediately he speaks of estrangement of that being. Whereas for Stirner, it's not an estrangement. It's that the speaking being itself, the species being itself is strange. You know, and I think that's a fundamental distinction. When I read Marx, particularly the Marx of this particular period, I hear a Marx of capitalism where there's estrangement within a world between one's product and between oneself and one's objects, oneself and other workers, and these various four types of estrangement that we're all familiar with, but precisely within a world that is called capitalism. It's not clear to me that Stirner exists in that world. This is the world of modern philosophy, the world of the prison house of being, the world where being is subjected to within the world and these sorts of things, being as subsumed in representation and all the various ways in which we think about it. In other words, the subject is there, if we can talk about a subject, as a lack, as something missing within the field of representations and so on. And this is the problem, like, how do we get back to our species being, our creative capacities are being, are missing, we're not able to tap into them, this sort of stuff. For Stirner, I don't think there's any problem. It's not lack. Lack would be an advancement for Stirner in a certain nostalgic way. You know, the problem with Stirner and where Stirner's work can lead, possibly, but where he's also critiquing, is that when the world goes missing, you're no longer estranged within it anymore. You're estranged between worlds. You know, and this is a fundamental difference. This is why, in some sense, I don't think Marx, at least at this period, really speaks to our current predicament anymore. Because I think basically we're in something like a feudal mode today, where we're not estranged within a world, within a field of representations and this sort of stuff, where we can talk about things like constitutive lack or whatever, a category of revolutionary subjectivity and so on. Instead, we're estranged between farms, platforms, and whatever else. And so I think what Stirner does is he's a bit of a prophet of the coming world, but he also doesn't know how to do something with it yet. This would be my admittedly very naive reading.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks so much. So given that we only have about 2 minutes left, I'll give both of you all, if you have any questions for each other, any comments, feel free to send those at each other. And if you don't, also y'all can feel free to plug anything that's going on with y'all, anything you would like to kind of push our audience towards. That would be a wonderful time to do it.
Are you talking to us?
Oh, yes, to our speakers. If you have anything you would like to share, comment on each other's work.
It'd be nice to have a longer debate with Dwayne about, you know, capitalism, feudalism. What are we in right now, and who speaks to us more, Marx or Stirner? Because I disagree, right? I don't think we're in feudalism. I think we're still in capitalism. Although, you know, maybe with feudal characteristics, I think that's possible. I can give you that. So I think they both speak to us. I think there are naive and more sophisticated ideas of estrangement, right? And I think the idea that like our essence is estranged, and you know that's what capitalism is, I think is very kind of a simplistic one that should be criticized. But there are other conceptions of estrangement that I think Stirner also criticizes, right? I don't think Stirner's criticizing like our estrangement from ourselves, because you know we cannot really lose ourselves for Stirner, right? We're always consuming ourselves. But he criticizes you know, when that process of consuming ourselves, of taking control of ourselves becomes blocked, right? Becomes kind of interrupted and becomes misfires. And I think there is a proto-critique of alienation in Stirner. And I think what Marx does is try to give that social causes, you know, for better or for worse. And Stirner doesn't really, right? He says that these causes are more deeper, right? They could be psychological, they could be social, they could be historical, they could be religious. Marx wants to give a more concrete genealogy of the causes that block our power to appropriate our lives, which is capitalism. I think it's a powerful argument because it also motivates kind of action, but also it can be ideological, given, you know, in certain ways. So yeah, I'd be wondering to hear what you would say, Dwayne, to that defense of the relevance of Marx and Stirner.
Yeah, we have hit time. Unfortunately, I didn't play that super well. I do hope you two can keep this dialogue going in some capacity. I think there's some really interesting kind of similarities and tensions between the two of y'all. But I want to say thank you both again for sort of coming here. Really interesting work. And as well, thank you to the audience. And of course, thanks to Cal for putting this all together. We have our next panel coming up at 11:20, I believe. It's called Stirner's Place in Philosophy. But that's going to happen at 11:20. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break here. And if you have anything to add, Cal, feel free.
I don't think so, except for the next presenters. You're already in the call, so just if you have anything that you're going to be sharing, now is going to be the time to start making sure that that works. But thank you both to both of our presenters, Jacob and Dwayne. There's excellent presentations. I enjoyed them a lot, and I hope that the dialogue between your two positions kind of keeps going. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll go ahead and take our break.